of working with the Tesla technology. He's been researching it since 1975, and he's come up with what I personally believe are some of the best theoretical and mathematical concepts for explaining what's going on and what's possible. He's an electrical engineer. He also has a degree in systems engineering, and he's published 3 books which we have available out there, and these are books that I'm constantly recommending to one person or another. So here is Moray King.
Oh, thank you very much. We're just adjusting the sound. This conference has been one of the best attended conferences I've been in at years, and I think a lot of us feel that there's a pressing need right now to get this technology accelerated, and I'm doing the best I can on this particular presentation to see how can we get big effects as inventors and engineers. And I think Steve Ellswick and the staff has done a terrific job. Let's give them applause. When I go back, usually every week, all my colleagues at work start to badger me, and they said, what happened at the conference? And some of them are, oh, so stuffy. They say, well, gee, how can you dare attend a conference like that, let alone speak at one? And you know, aren't you worried about your reputation? Well, I said, well, for the first thing, my reputation was blown out years ago. And I said, well, where else could I learn, for example, the proper gas a Scoutmaster should use when making campfire balloons? Like Larry Oiha had taught me that. And then Jeff Bahari, I learned, where can you exchange toilet rings for Tesla technology plans? So, do you know? I said, I know. And after all these years, Ralph Zudoff finally explained why I have been talking to water. So, to get to the big effects, Cascade Discharge is a way that Ken Shoulders has been using to generate from small EVs large ball lightning. We'll see it in some inventions embedded, unwittingly perhaps by the inventor. And that'll be pretty much the topic of the talk. But in the process of doing the research, I dug up a ton of information on vortex forms that really got me excited, and I'm going to share that information. Okay, well, when I first started back in the 70s, I never heard of zero-point energy. How many people before coming to this conference have heard of zero-point energy? Yeah, we've done our job, guys. But I never heard of it. I knew that space was empty and this ether thing. And so we'll go into that, how the zero-point energy is like the ether. We'll talk about big effects can be activated by vortex forms, especially plasma vortexes and vortices and vortex rings. We'll look at some of the inventions and experiments that are done by the inventors that are using this. And we'll explore some deep mysteries regarding the nature of space and producing energy and charge. In fact, we'll even explore the mystery of mankind. The word mankind is comprised of 2 words, mank and eind. What do they mean? No one knows. That's why it's a mystery. The philosopher Jack Handy taught me this. Back to the mystery of space. Back in the turn of the century, in fact, from the start of science, everybody believed in an ether. It supported the propagation of light. Maxwell envisioned vortices and hydrodynamic vortex activity in the ether to explain electromagnetic fields. It's basically a hydrodynamic theory. We know that the famous Michelson and Morley experiment showed that there was no ether drift, there was no static ether. The Earth should feel a wind as the ether rushes by. It should change the way light propagates in the famous interferometer text. And since this time, the scientific community has said, oh, there is no ether, and empty space is empty, and people just love the theory of relativity, which was much easier to explain if you just assumed there was more ether. But what I did not know, that at the time, a colleague of Michelson, who worked with Michelson, Dayton Miller, was the president of the American Physical Society, and he went to the trouble of doing extensive ether drift experiments using the interferometer. He did the work for over 20 years. He started working with Michelson. His interferometer was 10 times more sensitive. He made over 200,000 measurements. He made 12,000 turns of the interferometer, working over 20 years, over all seasons. Now, if you contrast that to the Michelson and Morley experiment, they only did 4 6-hour runs in the same week at one location. He did a couple locations. He did it at the basement level and at sea level. He also went up at the top of Mount Wilson next to the observatory and did measurements out there. And what he discovered was the same result that Michelson and Morley got when they did their experiment in the basement, an ether drift on the order of 10 to 20 kilometers per second. He got a bigger ether drift when he went up to Mount Wilson, and it was and Michelson and Morley never got a null result. They got this small result. And he was showing that he could show there was a sidereal variation in the result as the Earth rotates, and it supported an ether drift model where the ether is kind of being dragged by the Earth, and the Earth's galactic motion would have the ether one come by, but there's an ether drag component that's pretty large. And so this physicist was the president of the American Physical Society. He was like the lead professor of all of physics during this time, and he did the careful, definitive interferometer work, and his work has been banished. It's a very interesting paper by James DeMeo at his website. The work has been diminished, and it talks about the cover-up and the politics that went on to try to bury his work, because Einstein could not discredit him during his lifetime. Every criticism of the experiment he could defend by running control experiments to show that's not much of an effect on all the criticism. So interestingly enough, I believe that the scientific community rejected the ether, but the true scientist was discovering ether at the time. So this has completely turned me around as to the nature of the ether, and the zero-point energy are basically models trying to describe the same thing. It's this energetic substrate in the fabric of space that gives rise to everything that we'll explore. So I highly recommend James DeMeo's paper. Classical physics could not explain black-body radiation and atomic stability. And their classical formulas, the black-body radiation appeared to be infinite. It didn't make any sense. The atoms should have decayed to nothing because the electrons would spiral into the nucleus as they radiate away their energy. So according to classical science at the time, nothing should exist. I guess they observed and realized there's something wrong. This ushered into science about 1930 quantum mechanics. Now, there were many different interpretations of quantum mechanics. Now, I'll have to apologize for overshowing the slide, but it is my favorite slide.
This is from Moray's mail order school.
We have many degrees. Well, one of the interpretations is that the fabric of space itself is energetic. It consists of fluctuations of energetic energy. Oh, boy, I like that phrase. Fluctuations of electromagnetic field energy gives rise to the uncertainty principle, where everything jitters about. It gives rise to pair production out of the vacuum. Electron-positron pairs can come into existence and go out of existence very quickly. There's many papers in the Physical Review and other journals, and the Physical Review is considered in the United States one of our most prestigious journals, supporting the notion that the vacuum energy is this
Make sure you point the loaded end. I mean, the open hole end is the way you point.
Oh, it keeps shooting me.
You're not. There you go. Oh, it's a taser. You grabbed the taser, not the laser pointer.
Okay, good. Okay. Boyer in the 70s was the leading proponent in the United States for zero-point energy theory, and he showed that the quantum effects all the quantum effects can rise from matter's interaction with the zero-point energy. Hal Puthoff picked it up in the 80s, and he's derived papers showing how the hydrogen atom is stable, that he proved in 1993 that it could actually be an energy source without violating thermodynamics. He showed how gravity could rise from it, and he showed the paper that got everybody excited was that inertia could arise from it. So that implies that if you can control the zero-point energy in any statistical sense, because there's so much there, that you could create inertial drive like a flying saucer, where you could accelerate abruptly without feeling the inertial stress. It has a spectrum that's described in the literature. It has to have this cubic relationship. So the higher the frequency of the zero-point fluctuations, the greater the energy density. But it leads to an absurd result. It appears to be infinite energy at every point in space. They model, in the literature, they're modeling it, especially in string theory. Here's an example from Lee Smolin's book of a single vacuum fluctuation. It distorts space and time because the energy density is so great. They're quoting numbers like 10 to the 93rd grams per cubic centimeter, absurd numbers. At very small distances called the Planck distance, it's about 20 orders of magnitude smaller than the size of the electron, and very rapid time scales. So the fabric of space looks like a churning plasma with these mini holes on the order of the Planck length, 10 to the minus 33rd, where electric flux enters and immediately leaves. And this is a turning, churning, chaotic virtual plasma. That's the nature of the ether. It's bipolar, so it gives rise to electromagnetic fields and electric charge and electric flux. And I asked the question in the 70s, can this be tapped as an energy source? And the answer was pretty much the same from all the physicists at the university. They said, no, it's chaotic, it's random. Random things must forever remain random. That's the law of entropy. But then in 1997, Ilya Prigogine wins the Nobel Prize in chemistry for describing how systems can evolve from chaos to self-organization. And it was just in the nick of time, so to speak, because that's just when I asked the question, and all of a sudden he receives the Nobel Prize. Interestingly enough, we asked Boyer, Timothy Boyer wrote a letter and said, gee, do you ever think of applying Prigogine's principles of self-organization to the vacuum energy? And he wrote back and said he never heard of Prigogine, and he doesn't think things can self-organize. So it was very interesting to see that the scientific community was very fragmented. And somebody else asked Prigogine, have you heard of the vacuum energy? He says, no, empty space is empty. Everybody knows that. So it's interesting that but if you combine their work, all of a sudden you build the case for not only how that you can tap the vacuum energy as a source, but how to do it. The principles Prigogine described on how the system evolves from to self-organization, the system must be nonlinear, far from equilibrium, and have an energy flux through it. And the descriptions of the vacuum energy was just that. It fulfilled the role of that. This is a flatland slot like the plane of the table, and the zero-point energy comes through at right angles. This is geometrodynamics from Archibald Wheeler. It's the orthogonal model for the zero-point energy. As the flux comes through from the higher dimensional space, this looks like the background chaotic zero-point energy fluctuations or the virtual plasma. If there's a slight tilt to it as it comes through our space, they say the vacuum is polarized. If there's vorticity as it comes through, we detect that as an elementary particle. So it's like the flux of the zero-point energy, of the zero-point flux, is the river flowing by, and the whirlpool is what we detect as elementary particles. So everything owes its existence in time from the steady flux of the zero-point energy, keeping all particles and everything in existence and alive. A wonderful book that just came out this year is by Robert Laughlin, A Different Universe. His thesis was everything that existence arrives from collectives, collective coherence from a lower order substrate. And it's like a perfect example, and he cites a similar example of organization from the vacuum fluctuations to give rise to the elementary particles. So finally, there was somebody, and he's a Nobel Prize winner. He's stressing the same thesis that I've been stressing for years, so there's plenty of help in this realm. Well, how do we tap the vacuum energy? For the inventors, we just work with Prigogine's principle. We work with a highly nonlinear system like a plasma. We abruptly drive it far from equilibrium with abrupt discharges, and especially unipolar discharges. And we maximize the zero-point energy working with ions and vortex forms. Well, why do we work with ions instead of electrons? Well, the description of the vacuum polarization of conduction band electrons is like a smeared charge cloud Conduction band electrons are effectively in thermodynamic equilibrium with the vacuum fluctuations. And that's why in normal antennas and in normal electrical circuits, we don't really see many energy anomalies or any energy interaction with the vacuum fluctuations or the zero-point energy. However, the nucleus of an ion exhibits steep lines of vacuum polarization. And this can be used when abruptly moved to activate energy out of the vacuum. So we work with plasmas to do the activation. Do they observe this in the standard experiments? They sure do. They call them exotic coherent vacuum states in quantum electrodynamics. In a collision, they see that the vacuum gets organized and there's excess energy here. I don't think they're actually looking and measuring excess energy. They're just observing the coherence. Because in the standard literature, you can't claim a violation of conservation of energy, and it's wrong in general to claim I'm tapping energy out, even though that many do, but they always say it's a small amount. What happens when we oscillate a large number of ions together? It's called the ion acoustic mode of the plasma. And it can launch large organizations in vacuum polarization in the zero-point energy or the ether, and they call them vacuum polarizations displacement currents. In the experiments working with the plasmas in the ion acoustic mode, they observed the large radiant energy absorption, high frequency spikes, runaway electrons, anomalous plasma heating, and anomalous plasma resistance. If we looked at it from the Wheeler's model, that the surge of abrupt motion of ions produces a bending of the flux, the zero-point energy flux, and this bending puts a little more energy in our space, and it manifests in the electric circuit as excess voltage or a voltage spike. And then once you have that excess voltage, now normal electron behavior can respond to it, and it appears to have more energy in the system. Now, what if we could, instead of jerking the ions, what if we could organize them and have them move in an organized form? The ideal form would be a vortex. They observed this in plasmas, and it's called the Beltrami vortex because it's essentially a force-free vortex and exhibits a tightening towards the tip, an implosion type event. And the curl of the velocity is proportional to the velocity vector, and curl means the vorticity of the flow, if it's in fluid dynamics. And if it's in plasma dynamics, they observe that the curl of the magnetic field is aligned with the magnetic field. And this is a natural form the plasmas want to form in. They observe it, Bostic was observing, and he observes pair production of these vortex forms in the plasma experiments. And they have opposite helicity when they form up in the pairs, very much akin to pair production from the vacuum. Oh, here's the type of organization that can occur. We have filaments that occur, these plasma vortex filaments, and if the filaments start to kink, you can produce a higher order filament. And you could see this continuing. This could produce the next string, and then that could start to kink, and you have another higher order filament. So ideas like this could be the foundation of string theory, for example. If a vortex filament closes on itself, we get a vortex ring, and that's called a plasmoid. All these forms, if they involve ion motion, can trap and cohere the vacuum energy. So I started looking for anomalies associated with vortexes. Vortexes in matter, if you just start to charge them, could start to exhibit anomalous energy. This is a great website. It has wonderful pictures, and they're talking about the electrical activity that arises from vortexes. And Peter Thompson's a professor in England, and he has a web page that is on the same thesis, that the vortex phenomenon in the plasmas is the same as what's going on in the tornado. In fact, it's the foundation of it. There's the plasma experiments. Here's an exhibit of the tornado. And on his web page, he describes the nature of the charge. The reason the tornado is stable is because of the charge in the charge vortex, the magnetic fields. This is a vertical cross-section of the tornado cylinder. And charge goes into the page and out of the page. And all this produces a stable plasma sheath that's the foundation for the stability of the tornado. The other place we see vortex filaments is in the sun. This Scientific American article came out in 2001. And what's the paradox of the sun's hot corona? Well, the corona is too hot. It's approaching 1,000,000 degrees. Here's the surface of the sun. And all of a sudden, we have way more, it's hotter and way more energetic away from the surface of the sun due to the solar flares and the activity of the corona. Their solar flares are coming up. This is a nice picture. It's a nice website here, too, on their theory of the sun. And so what's happening in these solar flares? Well, the Scientific American article described that when the flares, two filaments of their plasma filaments, and when they cross, when their tips cross, there's all of a sudden release, 10 to the 25th joules of energy. Just completely anomalous. They don't know where this energy is coming from. Well, I think it's coming from the vacuum energy. When this occurs, it's like a destruction. And what they also observed is that the corona consists of a fractal nesting of micro flares, nano flares, and pico flares. So it's like flares all the way down that are supporting the larger solar flares. It's like all these vortex filaments on the surface of the sun, the smaller ones supporting the next larger ones at the higher level. If you want to see what one looks like, they can actually photograph them now. Recently, this is a sunspot, and this blow up here is actually a vortex filament. Here's this NSET's blow up of this, and here's a blow up of a single one. And this single, looks like a solar tornado. It's over 1,000 kilometers long, and the duration is more than an hour. This is a plasma vortex filament in the sun. I highly recommend that website. And so the bottom line is that this vortex filament activity could offer a new source of energy that's coming from the sun. It could be coming from the vacuum energy, the zero-point energy. And you see all these little forms here? These are likewise vortex filaments. It's like the sun's surface has a medusa of wiggling filaments like medusa snakes, right? It's just incredible that the sun has this complex activity. And these are just the big ones that we can see. And they're sitting on a bunch of little ones. It's absolutely fascinating that the sun itself could be sourced in the vacuum energy and all the heat that we see. Where else do we see activity? They just put up a series of satellites they call the cluster satellites, and they're observing the magnetotail of the magnetosphere of the Earth. And all the action's back here in the tail, and the tail goes all the way out beyond the moon. And they've observed now lots of vortex activity in the magnetotail and tremendous energy anomalies. And what's interesting is the energy anomalies, huge surges of energies occur at these neutral points. And they're seeing that these vortexes give rise to plasmoids or vortex rings in the magnetotail, and they travel back and forth in the tail and they come back towards the Earth. It was just absolutely fascinating. I didn't know all this activity was happening in our magnetosphere. And these surges of energy are completely anomalous. And I believe likewise they could be coming from the vacuum energy. I really got a kick out of this inventor. I started looking for inventions using vortex to see if they observed any unusual energy. And what Frank Polifka did, he made a tornado in a can just using compressed air. And it has a remarkable property. If anything you put in, it starts hot at the top and it gets ground to a very fine powder and coming out the bottom, and the powder's cold. And one of their customers is in Australia, and what they're doing is grinding coal into coal dust, very fine coal dust, which happens to burn very cleanly, very efficiently, and they're very excited for that pilot plant in Australia. And he originally came up with it for waste disposal, for disposing any type of waste, because you can convert anything to a fine, dry, cool powder. And there was a funny caption right here on the website when I first got this picture, and it said, "Bring on the chickens." And it so happens that their very first customer of this company was the poultry industry. And when they had a big mess because you know, it had to get rid of the chicken waste, and it turns out you could throw anything in here, talons, feathers, chicken carcasses. It just didn't matter. It all comes out the same. A fine powder. That powder was on the order of a micron, fine, cool powder, which then could be used as fertilizer and everything else. Or they said feed. Okay, so what? I wouldn't eat it. So they had trouble getting the patent. It just came out because they couldn't believe. They said, whoa, for that little amount of energy of compressed air, we can't explain how you could grind anything up to this fine powder. The energy doesn't seem to balance. They're puzzled over this. So I recommend that we record this patent, download copies of this patent, because I think if the government ever catches wind that if you ionize this vortex, you could produce excessive energy, they'll yank that patent in a fit of suppression. But we will really know, we will know who's really behind that suppression. It's the chickens. What if we could take a vortex ring, a plasma vortex, a filament, and close it on itself? Now, a vortex filament won't close on itself. Once it forms, it has so much concentration of energy, it doesn't want to close back on its tail. So in order to make one of these, and they observe them in the actual plasma discharge experiments, you need perfect boundary conditions. Ken Shoulders discovered the boundary conditions because he can make these small vortex rings that he calls charge clusters, or later he named EVs, meaning electron validum, because strong electron. Because these small ball lightnings, they would launch off the tip of an abrupt pulse, and they would go along the dielectric and then hit the witness plate as they come into the anode, and then he could see the amount of damage they did to the witness plate. And he says he proved that he had an energy anomaly right from the get-go because he only had picojoules on his capacitor, and he had way too much damage on the plates. So he knew he was dealing with something special where there's an energy anomaly. Masyats in the Soviet Union, who's the president of their Academy of Sciences, explained in his paper how the electron validum, or the charge cluster, forms. This is a blow-up of the point cathode, and there's a little bit of melt that occurs right here, a little liquid metal, and a protuberance of liquid metal protrudes just before the discharge into the glow plasma that's surrounding it. And then what happens at the moment of discharge, it blows its tip. It's like blows its top, and there's the circulation actually ends up forming a vortex ring. You have, because if it's a liquid, you have perfect symmetrical geometries to make the vortex ring itself. Ken Shoulders says, well, I eventually erode my tips, so what I'll do is use liquid metal to replenish and coat the tips, and that way it stays sharp the whole time. So he does liquid metal experiments. He's able to launch electron validums over and over again off the same electrode. These counter electrodes, what they do is they repel the ions so that he can just get the pure EV form. So it turns out that the front edge of any spark, any abrupt electrical discharge, typically has these EVs coming off, and they contain the anomalous energy. And so you want to get rid of everything else behind him. So Ken's very careful with, on his discharge to do just dump the capacitor, get the single unipolar event, and out comes the anomalous ball lightning. And he believes it's cohering to vacuum energy, or it could be an etheric form. It's pretty tough to explain. Here's some of the anomalies. He calls them now EVOs, or exotic vacuum objects, because they're hard to explain. He believes he has vacuum energy or ether trapped in this in a coherent way. They appear to be collections of 10 to the 11th electrons and about 10 to the 6 ions. Their charge over mass ratios, just like the electrons. You can measure that in the deflection experiment. They travel approximately the 10th of the speed of light on a typical launch, and they contain excessive energy. How to explain them is pretty tough. Our own Dr. Jin and Dr. Fox, right here in town, proposed a classical model of a toroid where the intense magnetic fields from the poloidal rotation around the ring would trap the electrons and trap on the ring and squeeze it down. The trouble is, for the sizes and everything else in the classical calculation, he would then predict energy density exceeding that of the neutron star. Well before you get that classical result, we know we're going to involve other things like the vacuum energy and everything else. So Zalitsky and Tibbett in the Physical Review published a paper trying to explain its stability by modifying the vacuum and showing how when discharges occur abruptly enough, like on the order of 10 to 15 seconds, then the fabric of space itself changes and the permittivity changes, and you can start to create these trapped potentials that he called quantum potentials. And thus, in a way, this is like one of the first papers in the Physical Review that's talking about an ether organization. Something of the fabric of space has changed due to the abrupt discharge. One anomaly is they tend to form up into necklaces when they form. And why should negatively charged items stay stable in a group? You'd think they just fly apart. Well, this could be actually evidence of a decay of a larger one, a large vortex ring that's gradually decaying, because this is a very characteristic of a smoke ring decay. So I think that it started out as a large EV and it's just gradually decaying down. Very rarely, off the same apparatus, he would actually observe positive EVs. They would have the E over M ratio like the positron. They deflect the other way, but they were not collections of positrons. When they hit the plate, there was no annihilation and all this, the gamma radiation that you would expect. And they've also seen pairs of EVs form, positive and negative pairs. So they're getting more mysterious and perhaps more exotic. A plasmoid, in the plasmoid experiments by Bostic back in the 50s, he would observe in the plasmas vortex rings forming in pairs of opposite rotation. And he called it a quantum condition, where the number of rotations along the donut would be an integer amount, just like a natural quantization. And from the literature of occult chemistry, this is from the esoteric literature, at the turn of the century, work was channeled by psychics, and they came up with what they called the anu, this ether vortex form, to describe positive and negative charge forming from the vacuum, forming from the ether itself. And I look, boy, this is really similar to what's being described and what they see in the plasma physics. And yesterday, it would look very similar to the water vortex experiments of Ralph Sidoff. Here's some of the exotic observations that were observed. The EV can turn black, where it manifests less charge and less mass. It's like its charge and mass are variable, and you can't see it anymore. It turns black. But with a little electromagnetic excitation, he can re-excite it, and it starts emitting light again, and it seems to have more charge and mass. So it seems like the charge and mass seem to be variable on these EVs. And there's a propulsion effect where they seem to capture debris. Jack Sarfati attempted to explain it by saying, gee, it's like an inertial drive or a warp drive where we're organizing the vacuum energy around it, like a flying saucer type propulsion. And his paper is on Ken Scholer's website. And they're describing this as occurring from the field around the EV. So if we can understand this electron validum, we can get a lot of technology that could possibly rise from this, both energetic and propulsion. Peter Grenou is famous for his water arc experiments. He did these at MIT originally back in the 80s, and he could show that with high-speed photography that he has a plasmoid, or like a vortex ring, forming in the barrel of his water gun, and he's shown that he has anomalous energy and anomalous force coming from his water explosions that are outside the realm of standard science. Well, Ken Scholer says, well, you want to see a water explosion experiment, have I got an anomaly for you? And he visited Peter Grenou, and he finally disclosed his water vortex experiments where he shoots an EV down a water vortex through a borehole that was made by an early EV. So this was on the order of 10 microns in diameter. EV's on the order of a micron. And he says, you would not believe the force you could get off this pulse when you did that, just shooting an EV down a vortex. And he kept this secret for a number of years because he was hoping to make a practical machine that could run on this power, because it had so little energy it took to make the EV, and he got so much power off the pulse. And the problem was the power was so concentrated he could not find a way to practically absorb it. Anything that it hit, it would damage and break. He said the analogy was like shooting a bullet at a windmill blade. It was a complete mechanical impedance mismatch. And then I thought, oh, but what if you used it to drive another vortex, this pulse here? And if this vortex is positively ionized, either due to the friction of the particles or due to pre-ionization at all, then you could trap this powerful force to help drive the vortex. So one small little vortex with the EV excitation is driving a large vortex. And then I thought of Frank Polifka and his Windhex device. I said, oh boy, put those two together, and then they'll yank the patent. The chickens will be upset. Another place where we see the ball lightning coming off is in a circuit breaker that were on the Guppy magazines, Guppy submarines. That was the Cutlass class of submarines. And interesting enough, I have a brother-in-law who was a sailor at the time on these submarines, and he actually witnessed it once. This green plasma ball, it's green because of the copper, will come off the circuit breaker on a particular discharge that accidentally occurs, and it's been observed more than once. It's hard to repeat, but it's been cited in the literature. By the way, I highly recommend Frank Zinarzik's website, because he's done a wonderful job of collecting ball lightning-like incidents. And it's really one of the best collections I've seen, so he's a great website. It's also seen these EVs are likely launched in fractal emission, where we see this anomalous glow that can last for hours when a crystal's cracked. Even when you bite on a lifesaver in the dark, the kids like to do that, like the Mint lifesavers, you can see this little bit of light. That comes from fractal emissions, very similar to the earthquake lights that occur from a fissure. When there's an earthquake, they see ball lightning coming out of the crack in the fissure. This is a small-scale example of that. And Ken Shoulders believes, and I think it's a good idea, that the light is really sourced from EVs that are created during fractal emission. And this is a good reference for it. One advantage there is if you crack anything, like, for example, when you load palladium with deuterium or hydrogen, you start to crack it. This could be the explanation for the anomalous energy in the cold fusion experiments, especially those experiments that use hydrogen, not deuterium, and they're still getting the anomalous energy. It's from cracking the material, creating EVs. We've even had some cases of ball lightning or small EVs appearing in Kirlian photography experiments. Now, Dave Faust, my friend, had an article published back in the 70s in Science magazine for the thorough studies they did on Kirlian photography. And it was very important to get good Kirlian photographs to work with unipolar pulses. And so Dave had to master how to produce a very good unipolar pulse to make clean Kirlian photographs. And he did capture on videotape EV-like incidents. We didn't know what it was at the time, but they could see the small plasmoid forms that would continue to exist well after the power was cut off, and they would exist in some cases for many minutes after the power was cut off. So Dave's right here at the conference. If you want to learn a little bit about how to make a clean unipolar circuit, he's a good guy to talk to. Ken Shoulders was recommending trying to capture EVs in what he called Electron Condenser, and that's the title of the paper on his website, which I highly recommend. And he's going to trap them in a traditional ion trap called the Paul trap, and it's basically an oscillating quadrupole. And this photograph is from Bostic's work and appears in the paper, Electron Condenser, about how Bostic would study shooting plasmoids, and they would tend to form up into a coherent state. And this is what Ken was observing, that when he shoots EVs into the trap, they kind of join the EVs that are already there and is forming like a new state of plasma. He's discovering, because really the big mystery on EVs is if it were separate charges, how could they all get trapped together? Why did they just repel themselves apart? It appears more like, oh, it's the nature of the circulation in the plasmoid form that makes it manifest charge. So the faster that it rotates and circulates, the more charge it appears to have. And then if it becomes less energetic, it appears to have less charge. So the phenomena of charge may be due to etheric circulation, like many people have been saying from the 17th and 18th century, and from our community, speculating that it's the nature of the flow of the ether that gives rise to the charge. And Ken Shoulders' work very much supports that hypothesis. Ken's also what he calls a Pico pulsar, how he can make a very extremely sharp unipolar spike, which is very important to launch some of these anomalies that we're talking about. And what he does, he fires an EV across a very tiny wire stub in the order of a fraction of a millimeter, And he can observe that the spike gets extremely sharp. That's why he calls it Pico. It's in the order of 10 to the minus 12 seconds for a very sharp unipolar spike. And then if he cascades two or more EV launchers, this is how he makes the large EVs, large form of ball lightning. He cascaded a number of them to produce the lifesaver size. And he did not like them. He did not recommend going this way to make large EVs. He says they are so energetic, when they hit the anode, the EMP that comes off of them damages the electronic equipment in the lab, even if it's not hooked up to the experiment. He said he just refused to deal with them anymore. They were just too dangerous. He definitely recommends, if you want to make the larger ones, working with the Electron Condenser and trapping them there and gradually making larger ones at lower energy. But the important point is that where we have cascades of sparks, which is really a stupid thing to do when you think of from an electrical engineering point of view, they could actually amplify. If you do have a ball lightning form here, which every spark does, they could start to amplify if the liquid melt occurs on each tip, or at least you would produce, like the Pico pulsar, extremely sharp unipolar pulses when we have a cascade discharge. And we'll see this in a couple inventions. Exploding wires have been known to produce anomalies, and they're well studied because they're hoping to get some fusion activity out of exploding wire experiments. And there's a foam-like structure that are producing these plasmoid forms. They don't call them plasmoids or EVs. They don't know what they are. They're on the order of 10 microns in size. And last time I counted this photograph, there's 500,000 of them. Are there any anomalies associated with the exploding wire experiments? Well, in February of this year, they got a doozy. We set the record, folks. We set for the hottest temperature ever done on Earth, 2 billion degrees. And they were exploding an array of tungsten wires. This was a control experiment by Sandia Labs. They used a 20 million amp pulse. This is a picture of the electric arcing that happens beneath their Z device. And this quote was in the newspaper release. The Z machine was releasing more energy than was originally put in. I said, oh, wow, that's pretty good from a conservative community of standard plasma. So I was impressed. I said, congratulations, folks. And they don't know where the energy came from. You set the record. Eric Lerner has doing some really nice experiments with the plasma gun, which is producing some really nice anomalies and heat anomalies. And he's looking to get fusion from it. He's a pure fusion physicist, plasma physicist. And he's saying, oh, wow, I'm getting such hot temperatures in these plasma focus devices that I can produce hydrogen-boron fusion. It's a clean fusion. Out comes 3 helium atoms. There's no radioactive waste. And I have extraordinary temperatures up at 1 billion degrees. He wasn't believed by the standard plasma community, but he can work with a small device on the order, he can do it in the garage. It's that size. It outputs its power directly as electricity, not as heat. That's a big, big plus in a fusion experiment. And of course, there's no radioactive waste in this type of fusion reaction. And at the heart of the device, he's observed a plasmoid. And when this plasmoid decays, it shoots an electron beam in one direction, an ion beam in the other direction, and that's how he's able to get his power out as electricity. And I predict he's going to run into a surprise, is that if he works inert gas experiments and he will see anomalous energy being produced straight up without fusion. And I think he'll get it from the vacuum energy. And he himself, I'm pretty sure, doesn't believe in the zero-point energy or all that stuff. And so I predict he'll get a surprise on his device. One of my heroes is Ed Gray. I've been following him since I started in the mid-70s. He made a pulse capacitor electric engine. He won Inventor of the Year in 1976, a very prestigious award in the United States. I always thought, oh, well, he's just discharging a capacitor, and he has through some coils that produce a bucking magnetic field that propels the rotor, and we got nice discharge activities in the gap, and I thought, oh, well, that's how he's producing it. And it was only later, when I discovered the work of Peter Linderman, that I found, oh, he's really exciting getting that pulse that's driving off a particular tube with a particular circuit. And the important thing about the circuit that fits the theme is he effectively made a cascade. There's a spark gap right here in the tube. There's a effective spark gap in a driver tube just in front of it. And he has a rotary commutator switch, or a rotary switch, where it's effectively like a spark gap. So he has a 3-gap cascade, effectively. And Ed Gray said, oh, the magic to making my circuit is split the positive. And this is effectively the positive side of the circuit. And he meant split the positive electrode up. And I don't think he talked about cascades, but it's an extremely important feature of driving the tube. And if you didn't have it, you wouldn't get that pure, sharp unipolar event that was very important to driving the tube. Well, what's special about the tube? There's an inner anode. There's a double-walled cathode. And it's shorted right here. Right? You say, why do you short that out? Well, it turns out in hollow cathode experiments, you can build up plasma inside the cathode grid. There's a spark gap in the tube. And here's another, it was interesting, they called this a carbon resistor, but I believe it could actually be part of the emission. If you have the cascade coming down and hitting this, you could have emissions off the carbon, and we'll have a talk later on about emissions from carbon electrodes. He patented twice, the same identical patent. The body of the patent is identical. The figures are identical. What was the difference? Why patent it twice? He was stressing in the second patent the importance of having the hollow cathode grid. It had to be a hollow cathode grid. And I started to focus on that and say, what is it about that grid? What happens in there? Well, here's a blow up. Here's the hollow cathode grid, and here's the inner anode. And what we do is we charge it up to a few kilovolts between here on the capacitor. And there's polarization of this plasma. It's well known in hollow cathodes, you build up plasma. And we polarize it. This is positive, this is negative. And when in this polarized plasma, if you abruptly spark, especially with abrupt unipolar event, you'll create a snapback effect where the electrons fly outward, the ions of the plasma compress inward, and you produce a very abrupt unipolar event. And I believe that from the ion motion, you will create the vacuum polarization wave or an ether wave in like an imploding direction. Here's the three-dimensional view of it, just in a very abrupt implosion event. Now, if you drive it too much, you'll dump the entire capacitor. This is the mode you don't want to use. You'll just dump your energy. But it also can create a symmetric compression event that could obviously activate the vacuum. I'm a real fan of Peter Lindemann. I highly recommend his book. He talks about cold electricity. And he'll be talking at the end of the day tomorrow. Another interesting work where they're observing the cold electricity effect is Christopher Arnold. It's a reasonably recent patent. And if you just Google his name, you can get to his website. And in the heart of his chamber, this is an inert gas chamber, he has a spinning commutator that's launching like EVs in this gap. And he's measuring cold currents. He can measure it on the coils of his device. It's actually cooling down. William Hyde really created quite a stir in the early 90s. I actually had some conversations with him. He said, oh, I'm getting suppressed. I'm going to run into the mountains and hide. He claims to have made a 20 kilowatt self-running device that was extremely simple. And I thought, oh man, this is it. This is going to change the world, where people could reproduce the Hyde device. He said he wanted others to replicate, and so I really talked about the device. And Hyde went into hiding at the time. So I said, okay, I'll talk to the community. And basically the device was a field chopper. At first it didn't look like anything spectacular. You have the electromagnetic voltage across the exciter plates, which is just holding a DC potential. You spin the fan blades in between, or these rotors in between, and what they do is they alternately shield and expose the stator elements to the electric field. This is nothing special. This is the field chopper that used to be done in the 20s and 30s. And under slow spin speeds, you see just that result. When the rotor shields the stator, it's neutral, then it polarizes when it's exposed, and you have a pulse rectifier circuit that absorbs the pulses. So you think, well, how in the world could this be special? But he says, but when I spin it very fast, I see this anomalous overshoot of voltage, 300 kilovolts, right, where there was only 3 kilovolts across the thing. Now, I said, that's the anomaly that you got to look for before you can really get started on a replication of the Hyde device. One of the hypotheses that fits the cascade is that as the rotor swings by, we start to accumulate all the charge towards the insulator. And if the insulator is quite thin, it discharges across to the next stator. And that discharge is creating like an EV event. And if you could see it across around the whole rotor, and he observes corona when he gets running up the speed, you'll have a cascade of discharges across each insulator. In Hyde's specs, where he had lots of rotor segments, he had 10 Hyde machines all on the same shaft, 10 Hyde machines. I believe there were 48 stator segments and 24 per machine on each plate. And these were the specs, and this got everybody excited. He made it self-running. He only had to drive it with that much power, and he got that much power out. 20 kilowatts self-running, an extraordinary claim on a simple device. I thought this would change the world, but he was not helpful in getting other inventors to replicate, so it kind of died off. Nobody ever saw the overshoot that tried to replicate. So it kind of died off. I only resurrect the idea right now is because I personally think there was something to it, since I did talk to him on the phone, and because the cascade hypothesis fits it on the activity of discharge across those insulators. He had a pulse rectifier circuit that people made fun of because it appeared to be shorted here, but L1 and L2, those lines, if you think there's residual inductance on those lines, then you get a very standard circuit, a pulse current multiplier, that effectively amplifies, that you can put a spike on the A electrodes, and off comes a lower voltage waveform with more current that you can now tap in a practical manner, then put that through standard rectifier circuits. So here's the summary. The ether and the zero-point energy are the same thing. We're just trying to describe the same phenomena. That if we make vortex forms, especially plasmas, involving the heavy ions, especially in plasmoids, we cohere to zero-point energy. We see many examples of anomalous energy. Very important to make sharp unipolar pulses to create the anomalies that could launch the EVs. And the cascade tends to grow them in a cascade discharge. And then we see inventors unwittingly doing this type of thing to produce the excess energy. If you want to read more, I have books that I made over the years. They're collections of my presentations. And just this book came out last year about T. Henry Moray. So I want to thank you very much for your attention.
Well, I don't know about you guys, but I think I need to make a critical announcement here before we go any farther. This is a no-smoking facility for those of you who think you're going to need a cigarette after that. I know I would. But we're going to open it up. We have 7.5 minutes for question and answer. I would like to use the same format we did yesterday evening. If we could line up at the left staircase, stage left staircase, your right. And we have 7 minutes for Q&A. Please, if it's at all possible, keep your questions to one subject at a time, okay? Yeah, I feel like I need a cigarette. That was great. Was that good for you? No.
Yeah, hello. Yeah, I'm David Baxter, and I'd like to know if, let's see here, Hal Puthoff says that there's a spectrum created with acceleration. And I wondered if that spectrum could be used to polarize zero-point energy and extract it.
Okay, so the question has to do, if you accelerate relative to zero-point energy, you'll see a different form of the spectrum. And part of that is a source of inertia. And so the question is, can that be used to tap the energy?
Yeah,
because they're just observing it. Well, they observe excess heat when you accelerate it to it. So I guess there's a heating effect. But it costs you energy to produce the acceleration in the first place.
True.
And so unless you're doing an inertial drive or something like that, I don't think just simple acceleration is going to produce it. However, the abrupt motion of ions relative to zero-point energy seems to create a little more energy than would otherwise be there. So that's where the coherent effect due to acceleration could occur, where you could get excess energy.
Also, Hal Puthoff is telling me that Schilder's device has problems scaling up to high levels. Any comments on that?
Yeah, Shoulders has realized that the EVs, for one, are too energetic, and the problems are damage to the equipment. Anytime they hit a wall, a conductive wall, they damage it. And so the big problems for scaling up is simply the damage that would naturally occur in the equipment. And that's why he's very interested in trapping them, where they'll be trapped where the energy's there, but they don't damage the equipment.
Okay.
Thank you, Moray King. And for the rest of you, is there anybody else who can run the sound and lights? I came for everything I wanted to hear. I'm going now. No, Moray will be available outside if anybody else has any questions. We're going to take a...